everybody, and welcome to my new YouTube channel, all about reviewing terrible superhero movies. I'm your host, Kenny, and today we're going to be talking about a little film called The Dark Phoenix. I struggle with this whole X-Men franchise, but Dark Phoenix is definitely a low point. So the rule on this channel is that we're only going to review movies that have a Rotten Tomatoes score of 50% or less for the critic review or the user review. This film had a 23% critic review, so not great. The user review was 64%. Usually the user review is a little bit higher. The users tend to be a little bit less harsh on bad movies. But 64% is still pretty low for a user review. So the first thing I want to talk about is what worked about this movie. Okay, but seriously, there were only really a few things that I felt were good about this movie. We'll get a little more into that later, but specifically, the first thing I thought that worked was, as a purely sci-fi action movie, it's not terrible. If this movie was disconnected from comic books, superheroes, X-Men, and a whole other franchise, and it was just a movie on its own, it would actually be okay. I think a lot of where it struggles is its attempt to be a part of this movie genre, which the MCU and other key films have just elevated to a certain standard that this movie does not live up to. The second thing I want to talk about as far as what worked was the final fight scene. Without giving too much away and spoiling the movie, there was a specific scene at the end that they reshot late in the production of the movie because it was too similar to another superhero film. As far as I know, they didn't say what film, but I'm pretty sure we're talking about Captain Marvel. And in fact, there's a lot of elements of this movie that are very similar to Captain Marvel. One of the scenes that they said was reshot was this ending action scene, and that actually turned out to be the best scene in the movie. I think if most of the movie had just stuck to that kind of action, it might not have been that bad. So that was definitely a highlight. The third thing I liked about it is that it definitely had some nods to the comic book Dark Phoenix storyline, which I feel like X-Men The Last Stand didn't bother with. You see Dazzler, who's a part of the Dark Phoenix storyline. There's a few other smaller things that the main bad guy kind of is reminiscent of the main bad guy of the Dark Phoenix saga. You've got the whole storyline with Professor Xavier kind of suppressing Jean's power, sort of lying to her as a child, and having to come to terms with Professor Xavier not being such a great guy. But yeah, you appreciated some of the nods. There were a few others, but those are the ones that are really sticking out to me right now. So what didn't work about the movie? The first thing that comes to mind is those nods that I just mentioned to the original story. That's all. The Dark Phoenix is one of the most popular and fleshed out storylines, convoluted as it may be, in the X-Men series. You've got a lot to work with there. I mean, the writers should have had an easy job of just telling that story in a cinematic way that makes it fresh, but still, the bare bones of the story is there. But there's some just huge key differences. There's huge parts of the story they decided not to go with. All of our main characters from the Dark Phoenix storyline, Jean Grey, Cyclops, they're teenagers in this movie, and in the Dark Phoenix storyline, they're adults. And I think that really hurts it. It does make it feel like a Twilight-esque kind of movie where you're having to deal with the angst of these teenage relationships. And that's really not the point of Dark Phoenix in the comics. And so while there were nods to the original story, it so badly tells that story that it also is it's definitely a negative. Second thing I thought was wrong with this movie was the pacing. it gets off to such a slow start, and that slow start is peppered with small action scenes, but not you really don't get any action scenes until you get to the end of the movie. Until then, it's just kind of an even sort of paced movie, like a slow paced movie with little bumps of action, and you just kind of you're sitting through it and you're like, when is something gonna happen? So yeah, the pacing was just kind of all over the place. They didn't have that quick sort of action comedy drama pacing of a typical MCU movie, or even some of the X-Men movies are, previously in this same series. The third thing is that while most of the characters get their sort of endgame moment, definitely coining that phrase, to sort of, bust out and kick ass. They do get those moments, and that it was, maybe we should add that to what worked, but before they get that, each one of those characters is kind of dragged through the mud, as far as, like, if you love that character from the comics or even the past movies, you're not likely to like what happens to that character. And there were some really confusing choices for how they handle the interactions with some of these really key characters, that just doesn't make sense until Dark Phoenix. It wasn't set up by previous movies. There was no precedent why these characters would act that way. So that was that was really bothersome. It by the end of the movie they have their moment, and so you sort of forgive it, but it still sort of bugs you. So that was definitely more of a negative. The fourth thing was this alien invasion subplot that was supposed to really be a stand-in for the alien subplot of the Dark Phoenix saga, which they definitely didn't have time to get into. With the Shi'ar Empire and Professor Xavier falling in love with an alien, and Dark Phoenix eventually going and destroying a whole alien planet while she's freaking out with the Dark Phoenix Force. They didn't have time for all that, and I get that. It's one movie, it's the last movie, and they've done pretty much nothing to set up this story. But the alien subplot they went with just is so unnecessary and so unfleshed out. Like, you're watching the movie, and when the scenes come with these aliens, you're like, oh yeah, that's part of this. And it's not until those scenes come up that you're, like, even thinking about it. In between those scenes, which are kind of all over the place, you forget there's even a threat of alien invasion. And so that kind of hinders your enjoyment of it, or even hinders your ability to relate to it, or the aliens' motivations, or what their powers are, because they just sort of come out of nowhere. And by the end of the movie, when you've got this huge push to finally stop the aliens, you've seen so little of those aliens and you know so little about them that it just feels stupid. And it is stupid. Number 6 is, I wouldn't say the special effects, I would actually say the practical effects. Namely, Mystique's costume. It's a huge downgrade from the past movies. And, doing some research on it, it seems like, Jennifer Lawrence was not psyched about being in another X-Men movie. And one of the ways they convinced her to be on board with it was saying, okay, well, we've come up with a new costume design that'll take just way less time. X-Men Apocalypse saw her just for no reason not being in her blue Mystique form as a way around that. This movie, she does sometimes revert back to normal Jennifer Lawrence, but for most of the movie she is Mystique, but it's a dumbed down Mystique. And I think, honestly, it doesn't even look necessarily that bad. The wig is terrible. It's just awful. But the skin is not terrible, but it's terrible because we've seen how good it could be. And it's clearly been downgraded. Like, you see it immediately and you're like, is this a cosplay of Mystique by someone else? So it's kind of jarring. The other beef I had is Cyclops' glasses that he uses. They look like something you got at Target in the toy section. First it goes like around his ears, like sunglasses, whatever. but the material it's made out of, it looks like cheap plastic. Like you couldn't even CGI them to look more shiny or solid. I mean, the original X-Men movies were did so much of a better job than this movie, which is like ninth in the series. It's well, not this. You get what I'm saying. It's been a while, and you're getting worse. That was really upsetting to me when I noticed it, and it's hard not to notice it. The seventh problem I have with it is Magneto. I feel like, series wide, they've just had trouble figuring out who is Magneto. Is he, a guy who wants what Xavier wants, but is willing to do more nefarious things to get it? Is he a father figure? Is he a genocidal maniac? Is he a murderer? Is he helping? Is he not helping? Figure it out, but Dark Phoenix, it does nothing to flesh out Magneto into a more serious character. I mean, just one movie ago we saw him mass murdering almost completely an entire planet because some, blue dude showed up and said, hey, these people really suck, let's take them out. And Magneto was like, well, they killed my daughter and wife with a wooden arrow. So, in this movie, we've completely forgiven him. And yeah, I mean, he helped to end that whole conflict in the last movie, but he's still kind of a dickhead, but he's kind of on his own little dickhead island, and so we're cool with it. But now we need his help, and he's convinced because of, see the movie, but now we're working alongside of him to fight the final threat, which is what happens in every movie, and you're like, okay, do we have to do this every movie where, like, he starts out as the bad guy, but then he comes around to being the good guy? That was Days of Future Past. I guess that's not what happened in First Class, but even some of the previous movies, in the original X-Men movie series, same thing, Magneto's a bad guy until he's not, which is, certainly a holdover from the comics, but just they keep doing it, and you look at this character and you're like, who is he besides a guy that can move metal stuff, which is always great. I mean, and this movie is no exception. Them showing Magneto using his powers is always dope, but him as a character is just, they don't know what to do with him. Xavier to another degree, but Magneto for sure. Number 8 is is very frustrating, okay? Because this is the last movie in this sort of X-Men cinematic universe that they've created, and it completely craps on the past movies that were good. So not only are you a bad movie, but you're a bad movie that makes the good movies worse. And Endgame's a perfect example of how you can go the other way with it. You can be a really good movie that's so good that it makes some of the bad MCU movies better. Dark World is the big one. You rewatch it now, and there's some things that you're like, that happen in Endgame that make you think like, okay, this is interesting. They just completely screw the timeline. They kill off characters who are definitely in the original X-Men movies. Days of Future Past sort of made it clear that those movies are a part of this universe. And then Dark Phoenix comes along and says, what movies? And you just kind of, you become confused. You're like, wait a minute. They can't die. What? And so it's just so stupid. Why? It's the last movie in the series. We know you're not making another one. You don't have the rights anymore. So why would you do that? Is it on purpose as a spite? Do you hate us as the fans personally? So that was just I got a problem with it. The ninth thing that and we're almost done, is that it starts there's so many like little subplots going on, which isn't necessarily always the worst thing as long as you can handle all these subplots, but it starts a bunch of little subplots that it never finishes. There's certain scenes where things that would have consequences happen, and then they just don't, and they don't tell you why they don't, and they don't make any effort whatsoever. There's so many different themes they're trying to do, and look, Dark Phoenix has that same problem in the comics, but the comic book world is a little more forgiving. When you're talking about a movie, you're supposed to be condensing it down to its deepest themes, to it, focusing this message and these characters, and it doesn't make any effort to do that in the movie. You see all these little things happening, and there's these sort of emotional subplots that just don't get answered at all. And you see the movie, and then when you leave the movie, you start thinking about, oh, wait a minute, what happened to that? And that's like the worst way to be when you're making a movie for nerds. That's the worst way to be, because we're gonna think about it, and we're gonna rewatch it, and we're gonna say, wait a minute. So yeah, it's just this movie is notorious for that. It's just all over the movie. It's little things that just don't get fleshed out. The last thing and the final thing is the acting. Your typical James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender are great, and I love them as those characters. I think they nailed it almost as good as they nailed it originally with Sir Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart. But beyond them and a few of maybe the other key X-Men, the acting is really stiff, especially from some of the main actresses. Who, Jessica Chastain was really stiff. Now, you can hardly blame her because, like I said previously, she plays one of those aliens, and those aliens are just such an underutilized, completely unfleshed out part of that movie. I can only imagine that being difficult to portray. So you can really hardly blame them, but it's definitely noticeable. The other key point there is Sophie Turner, who is, she's the Dark Phoenix. So there are moments where it's good, but as a whole, the performance was pretty stiff, and I wasn't really blown away by it. Honestly, it kind of was reminiscent of the Captain Marvel performance, where it's not terrible, but it doesn't really live up to some of your co-stars. It's kind of a situation where the acting around that actress or actor is so good that their acting stands out like a sore thumb, where maybe it wouldn't have otherwise. That's really not such a big deal. At the end of the day, this movie just fails to tell a good story. And so you look at all these other things and you kind of add them all up. One thing I want to start doing with these videos is picking a moment of the movie that wins hardest to watch moment for that movie. For this particular movie, I'm not going to do that because it would be a spoiler, and this is still a pretty recent movie that you might go see. So I'm not going to do that for this movie, but going forward, especially older movies, we're going to pick a moment that was like, okay, that was the hardest part to watch. All right, so let's talk about who was right, the critics or the users. And for this movie, I know it sounds like with my pros and cons list that I really hated this movie, but to be honest, when I left that theater, I didn't feel like my time had been wasted. I didn't feel quite as violated as you kind of do in some of these really bad movies. I couldn't really put my finger on why not, because the more you think about the movie, the more problems you have with it. All I can really say is that it's not a complete failure, but it's certainly not up to the standards that even just this series of movies, even if we take out the original 3 X-Men movies and we just look at these, this 4 movies in this series, it doesn't live up to the standard that at least First Class and Days of Future Past set. So, let's forget all other superhero movies. It doesn't live up to the standard that they have set for themselves. And to be the last movie in the series and not be able to accomplish that, it's pretty bad. However, it's worth seeing, maybe not in theaters, but in my opinion, it is worth watching it, especially if you're a fan of this series. And if you can sit through Apocalypse, you can sit through this movie. This movie is not even the worst in the X-Men franchise. And that is not much of a compliment, but it's certainly worth checking out if you're a fan of the X-Men and you watched all the other movies. If you sat through all the other X-Men movies, just sit through this one. But otherwise, I think for now, only having seen it once, maybe once I see it more, these problems I've talked about will bother me more. But we're going to go ahead and say that I agree with the users on this one. My final score of this movie is 5 generic shape-shifting aliens out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for watching my video. You can definitely expect to see more. Tell me down in the comments what movies you'd like me to review next. Again, the rule is it has to have a 50% or less on Rotten Tomatoes and be a superhero or comic book inspired movie. If it meets that criteria, I'll do it.